何を聞きたい？
いや、見た感想っていうか。
僕は自分の子供を見てたよ。
自分の子供。
大人になってない。
Born in Tokyo on January 5th, 1941, Hayao Miyazaki is the son of Katsuji Miyazaki. Katsuji owned Miyazaki Airplane, a manufacturing firm that made parts for Japanese fighter planes in World War II. Hayao Miyazaki started his career in 1963 as an animator at the Toei Duga studio, but he struggled to draw people, preferring to draw tanks and airplanes instead. His ambitions soon took him above road animation work, however, and in 1971 he moved to the A.Pro studio, and then moved on to Nippon Animation in 1973. In 1978 he directed his first TV series, Future Boy Conan. Then he moved to Tokyo Movie Shinsha in 1979 to direct his first film, the classic Lupin III Castle Cagliostro. In 1982 he created the manga Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind, and his first original animated feature was a film based on that manga in 1984. The success of the film led to the creation of the now world-famous Studio Ghibli, where he would produce the rest of his work. He followed up the success of Nausicaa with another original title in 1986, when he wrote and directed Castle in the Sky, a film about magic crystals, space pirates, and two precocious youngsters. Inspired by his father's aviation firm and his early animation work drawing planes, flight would very much be a motif in Miyazaki's work, though that was not immediately evident, as Miyazaki followed Castle in the Sky up with 1988's My Neighbor Totoro, a whimsical film about two young girls and their adventures with friendly forest spirits. The next year, Miyazaki adapted the Eiko Kadono novel, Kiki's Delivery Service, a story about a young witch who makes ends meet by running an air courier service. The avionics themes would persist, as 1992's Porco Rosso chronicled an Italian pilot cursed to look like a human pig. We saw Miyazaki's fame spread globally as Studio Ghibli and Disney signed a 1996 agreement that gave Disney the right to distribute 8 Studio Ghibli films, which included the very next one, 1997's Princess Mononoke. Now audiences worldwide had access to Ghibli's work, and the world was taken by storm in 2001 with the release of Spirited Away, which won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature. Witches, forest spirits, and body transformation themes kept reoccurring, and 2004's Howl's Moving Castle told the tale of a young woman cursed by a witch to inhabit a frail, older body if she couldn't unlock the mystery of a castle that changed locations. There were no castles or elaborate aeronautical set pieces in 2008's Ponyo, a very simple piece about a goldfish princess and her relationship with a young boy. Ponyo made back half of its budget in the USA alone, and the world was realizing what Japan had known all along about the creative mind of Hayao Miyazaki. The Wind Rises was a personal project, and a bit of a departure from typical Ghibli fare. It chronicled the life of Jiro Horikoshi, a man who designed the fighter planes used by Japan in World War II. He's currently hard at work on How Do You Live?, a tale about a young boy's development and the impact of friends and family. Hayao Miyazaki is a worldwide phenomenon, and his simple and beautiful films about children and their boundless imaginations and indomitable courage are absolutely timeless.
And welcome back to another Film Hooligans. We have a very special episode. In fact, the first episode ever that we've done a director of animation, and that is Hayao Miyazaki. Of course, I'm not doing this alone, but my name is John. I'm your host, and I'm joined by my co-host, as always, Mr. Jason Alt. How you doing, man?
Present.
Present as always. Also, I feel like we haven't had a special guest that we couldn't drink in a long time, Jason. We have Mr. Sam Tang. You come back from around the world, and thanks for coming on our show.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Yes, thank you so much for having me on the show. My name is Sam Tang, and I am so pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me on the show, John and Jason.
Absolutely. Super excited to have you. If you don't know Sam Tang, you should, because he is just like, if you need like someone that's just a good podcaster, like a great podcaster, just plug and play Sam Tang, because he is absolutely fantastic. So gentlemen, why did we decide to talk about Japanese filmmaker Hayao Miyazaki tonight?
Because we haven't done an animated filmmaker yet, and even though there are no real camera techniques to speak of, I really think there are narrative choices this director makes, and I think it's a challenge for us to talk about somebody who does films in a completely different way from everyone else we've covered before. And when you think animated film that people see, not necessarily anime, but like animated films, Miyazaki is the Disney of animated films.
He actually hates being referred to as the Disney of Japan.
Good job,
Because he
Jason.
signed a deal with Disney that stifled him creatively, and we're going to get into that. Ooh, I can't wait.
I mean, no doubt that he has inspired a lot of Disney films going forward, too. John Lasseter was kind of the driving force to bring, I think, arguably the most successful foreign animated film to light, right, in Spirited Away. But more on that later. Let's first kind of scale back as we do and kind of talk about him as a person first. And he came from not a he is married to a fellow animator in Akima Oda, but he his father he worked in aviation, and I think that was one of the biggest influences to his films that you could see. There's always some kind of a skyship or airplane, kind of aerospace in general.
Somebody is imbued with the gift of flight, because when there's not like a castle that can fly or something, it's a witch or someone that turns into a gust of air or something like that. So most of his films, some building or some person takes flight for sure.
And I think as an homage to his father, that he wants to make sure that it's correct as well. Like even the everything is fantastical, but even those kind of flying machines are correct, like functionally correct and functionally accurate within the confines of the rules of that universe. So you always see like attention to detail of like flipping on knobs and pulling levers and how wing mechanisms would actually work, relative to gravity and all that. So you could tell that that's kind of his, major nod to growing up with his father, and that's aviation, especially in that time. He's a 78-year-old man, so his father was probably at the forefront of aviation, so that of course that was inspiring.
So his introduction to animation was obviously informed by the fact that he grew up during wartime, right? He watched Japan, his earliest memories were Japan basically losing a war. So even though his father made warplanes, he was still really fascinated with aviation. And as we said before, that makes appearances in a ton of his films. And it seems like a lot of his early animation was influenced by the fact that he could draw planes and tanks and stuff like that way better than he could draw people.
Mm.
So I think like his early animation was informed by that. He thought about things on a bigger scale than just like an individual person, just based on the fact that he would rather draw a tank battle or like a bunch of planes flying through the sky than individual people doing individual people stuff. So I think that made him a better world builder. And even though like the stories he ended up directing, when he finally struck out on his own, were centered around individual people, I think he was adept at building worlds and thinking on a large scale and creating giant scenes for the characters to act in, just by virtue of the fact that he was always good at drawing battles before he got good at focusing on people. And most people start small and then work big. He started big and worked small. He got smaller in his focus as he got better at telling stories. And I think as much as he doesn't direct on film, I think that influenced the stories he chose to put on film.
I think you make a good point that he has to pick as a director what he decides to embellish in his stories. He can either go big and talk about war and talk about airplanes and tanks, but he also has this very strange quirk of highlighting these quiet moments in his characters' lives and these really mundane, almost like, why are we sitting here watching this? Like, why? There's these scenes in like so many of his different animated movies when one of his characters is like putting on a pair of slippers, or stopping for a moment to like tie their shoe, or when they round the corner they like stop because they tripped. And it's just like
Human
these
moments.
little moments, these very human moments give pause to things kind of that are happening in between. And because we're so like zoomed in on these small moments, when like Jason said, when we've got these big elaborate war scenes that are kind of violent and visceral, and there's a lot of upheaval, and if you put yourself into that scene, you're like, yeah, I'm definitely going to die, then it creates this balance, and it creates this, I guess, this idea of scale. You can't say things that are big in art unless you put something like scale birds next to it, and then you realize how big it really is. And I feel like Miyazaki does that with emotion, and does that with kind of like the mundaneness of human life. It's like really big conflict, really big upheaval next to little things like tying your shoe.
I think that, if you go in as, I'm not, I'm going to probably lose followers now, but I'm not a huge anime fan. And this Miyazaki is not an anime type of filmmaker whatsoever, because the difference is, like you said, Sam, like, anime is just, it's very loud. Everything's like over the top, but Miyazaki films scale that back and they let scenes breathe, and you really get to take in extraordinary like wide shots and just kind of transport yourself into these spaces. He even said, like, when he was younger, that he thought that the kind of traditional, and we're talking about like when he started back in the late 70s, traditional, anime at the time was really into like the Gundam and all these like, kind of like mechs and stuff like that. And he's just like, that's kind of childish. I like, obviously, like the magical realism, because that's all of his films, where it's these fantastical creatures, but it's all set in a really grounded environment, where he takes something like an airplane or a Zeppelin or anything like that, and then just kind of embellishes a little bit to where it still fits in the scope of something that's familiar.
I'm going to have to really disagree with you on that one. I think the thing is that he cut his teeth on anime, and he worked, and a lot of his influential figures, and I can't remember their names, I'm really sad to say this, but those other individuals that came before him were the godfathers of anime. They created Japanese animation, so he studied directly and had that influence him. But I think that what we're kind of missing in terms of what anime is that it's a style of animation that kind of goes through this journey of a hero, but commercialized anime is very loud and has to keep the attention of like teenage boys, high school audience. And you look at like manga is what like anime came from. It's like basically the Japanese version of comic books. And so those kind of like pulp fiction-y narrative things have to be fast-paced. They have to capture an audience. And so there's like these commercial, I guess, like necessities that have to make it work commercially. Like these companies have to sell that end product ultimately. But Miyazaki comes from that. And I think that he takes those things, like he takes Gundams and tank fights, and he puts them into giant bugs, and he puts them into giant forest spirits that are trying to destroy everything. And it's like he takes these tropes and then he puts them into these moments. But I think he kind of mystical realisms it. He kind of Miyazaki-ifies things to create kind of his own style. And he does, maybe he comes from a different era. Maybe he comes from a pre-war era or an era that's long gone in World War II, of like sweeping landscapes and like this romanticism of standing on a hill and having the wind go by while planes fly by. And he just, I mean, he's a pretty old guy, and he's lived through a very tumultuous and transformative time in modern Japanese history and modern world history. So I can kind of see where when you look at his work, you're like, no, he doesn't do the anime thing, but it still is anime, and every other anime person that's come after him has kind of looked to his work also for inspiration. Maybe not in terms of the genre, and has like redefined the genre, but just like today, we don't look at animation and Pixar and DreamWorks and we go, oh yeah, that's totally Walt Disney, Mickey Mouse on the steamboat. Like, it's not. And so we kind of ask ourselves, what is animation even?
just kind of ending, talking about him as a person. He's, one of those work first. Like he tried to call it in. He tried to retire, went right back to work. He has two sons, and one of them named Goro. Direct quote from him says, "My father gets 0 marks as a father, but full marks as a director of animated films." So his son's a fan, even though Miyazaki wasn't the most open of parents to go to. But yeah, and you mentioned his film influences, but he was also influenced by stuff like Animal Farm, The Snow Queen, King of the Mockingbird. So it's all these kind of like and that kind of tells you, or at least like it gives you the roadmap of the type of movies that he makes, like the and that kind of goes right into the themes, like everything's kind of man versus nature. Where it's just like, instead of going the traditional, like, man versus machine or sci-fi, going against Gundams or something like that, he kind of puts a naturalized spin on everything.
Now, if you look at the movies that were made in the West around the same time he founded Studio Ghibli and kind of moved out on his own, the stuff that was made in the West was sort of like Secret of Nim and animation like that. And the style of Western animation looked very kind of stilted. Like after seeing how smooth Japanese animation from that same era looks and how much better it holds up, if you go back and watch something like Secret of Nim, it almost looks like rotoscoped claymation. Like, if that makes sense. It seems very stilted. So I think one of his major innovations was making Eastern animation just look smoother. Where around the same time as he got started, Korea was doing a lot of animation that didn't look as nice, stuff like Speed Racer and Voltron and stuff like that kind of looked a little choppy. And if you look at his very early work, like the stuff he did for Nippon Animation and A-Pro Studio, like the Future Boy Conan series, and all his work on the Lupin the Third TV show, it's a little bit smoother. And I think, as much as we can say, oh, there's not much he does with a camera because he just does animation, I think he was one of the first directors that really was responsible for that push to have cinematic anime be a little bit smoother and just look more lifelike.
Yeah, I feel like his films are shot like they would be shot for a live action film, but with just going those extra, fantastical steps and adding those things. It's always a nice contrast. Like, his films do contrast perfectly, where they have this backdrop of real life. You have these, kind of normal characters, and then you have these cartoonish, larger than life characters as a nice contrast, and he does that not only with the animation but with the sound as well. It's like he makes everything has its own like sound thumbprint and signature. Every film is very pronounced, where it's like My Neighbor Totoro. Everything is you get just like realistic bird chirp or like bug chirps and wind through grass, but then that's juxtaposed with all the creatures making these kind of Looney Tune-esque sounds.
One of the things that was mentioned about his style of, I guess, filmmaking, if we could really call it that, is that he understands that there are limitations in animation, and he understands that there are limitations in hand drawn, and he's always dedicated his team to making sure that every frame that he's producing contains something hand drawn, and that's like why he hasn't gone to like computers, for example. But he's also like focused on sound and Foley design, just so that we would be more immersed in some of those scenes.
He said, there's a quote from him. He said, "Do everything by hand, even when using computer." So like as he's moved on to like have some of the grunt work in sort of piecing scenes together be used with computer, he still wants to draw everything by hand, and I think that's admirable.
Well, even now, like in their newest film that's that they're working on, I think it's How Do You Live? Toshio Suzuki was interviewed, the longtime co-founder and producer of Studio Ghibli, and he's just like, yeah, we take a month for 5 minutes of animation, and he's like, and right now we're doing like a month for 60 seconds, so we're pretty behind, but at least it's kind of worth the wait. And the same interviewer was talking to Miyazaki, and he's just like, oh, I can't wait for this. It looks like you're really taking your time. Miyazaki's like, just forget it, because who knows? Like, who knows if it's even going to come out? Just, like, don't get too excited, because they just refuse to put out schlock. I don't think really, they just hold it to a different standard, right? Like, they shoot it in ways, like I said before, in like a live action way, where, in a live action film, you're expected to have moments, at least, elongated or not, moments of quiet and like letting a scene sink in, or letting the sound or music kind of help with, move the story along. Usually in animation, in any animation, Western or Eastern, there's always, kind of something going, because it's traditionally made for kids, more so, even with the adult animation. So you're constantly having to drive the plot with new frames, and they're at a 2:3 frame, so you're only getting a new frame. You're only getting a new picture like every second or third frame, as to where other animation is doing one picture each frame. So they're really taking the time to let you kind of make your own decisions on what these characters are feeling and thinking about as well.
In Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, that movie by Sony, they did a mix of like using a 2:3 frame and a 1:2 frame, and they would do different like layers of cells. And obviously that was completely computer animated, so they had a lot of control over stuff like that. But even watching that film, and a lot of people said that was very visually stunning. Mm-hmm. There were moments in some of the, I guess, either the fight scenes or the movement scenes or action scenes where it really felt like it was a comic book, because like the protagonist and the character that was in focus was moving at a slightly different rate as the background or other elements on it. And so I only recently started to notice those kinds of technical details, and so I really am now interested in going back and watching some of these Miyazaki movies to really see if I can't notice some of that. I guess I just sometimes get so immersed in the story that I don't necessarily notice that, because you've always got those like quintessential Miyazaki like character reactions where their hair reacts along with their like look of surprise. And it's just like, but it's interesting to go back to see if we can spot whether or not that technical choice does inform some of that narrative storytelling.
I think that requires so much planning, because you can't go in and change anything once it's hand drawn. Like with a computer, you could mess with stuff, but with hand drawing, you have to plan ahead. You have to know what every reaction is going to be, because you're physically committing that. And I don't think he's ever going to stop, even though he realizes he's a dinosaur. Once he said, hand-drawn animation's a dying craft, but we can't do anything about it. Civilization moves on. Where are all the fresco painters now? Where are the landscape artists? What are they doing? The world is changing. I've been very fortunate to be able to do the same job for 40 years. That's rare in any era. So he's like, yeah, I'm very aware of computers, but I'm sticking with this because I'm not worried about the future hand-drawn animation. I wouldn't give up on it completely. Once in a while, there are strange rich people who like to invest in odd things. You're going to have people in the corners of garages making cartoons to please themselves. I'm more interested in those people than I am in big business.
It's an antiquated type way of thinking now, on whatever budget, but take as much time as we want, and that's why they kind of did their own studio, because not a lot of other studio houses have that kind of patience for that, no matter what the end product is. I mean, we're getting Pixar films like every, once a year now. We're getting 4 different Marvel films, 2 Star Wars, everything is just like super cranked out so fast, and they're just like, we're going to take our time, and it's going to be great. Like they must be confident in their end product to kind of demand that kind of respect.
It took scores of animators, and that's something that very much is done in Eastern countries right now. Like, people that are still bothering to do cartoons, if they're not doing fully computer animated like Family Guy, they are having Asian countries do that, because that's kind of the last place where people are still bothering to hire just huge teams of people just doing rote animation, doing like the same expression cell after cell. Whereas a lot of Western stuff, like you said, is just shifted completely digital. And I think Disney was the last holdout in the West, and when they sort of started doing a lot more computerized stuff and having fewer like armies of interns hand painting Tarzan in a bunch of different scenes, I think that's kind of when the industry shifted. But it's good to see that someone's a holdout, because it has a different feel to it. You can tell when something is hand sculpted.
It makes me also a little bit nervous, because can you imagine the first Miyazaki film that's like a flop, or like the latest, like the newest one in the future that's like the flop? That terrifies me, because it's like it takes so long to craft these things, and like you said, Jason, when you're doing this by hand, you're committing that to that cell. And that's like that expression that's locked in. And so what happens when you're not able to iterate? And right now, consumer preferences are so fickle, culture is changing. And so, on one hand, that's kind of like the cynic in me being very doubtful of that. But when we look at so many interviews with Miyazaki, and when we look at all of his work, he has a clear understanding of the human condition. And so the things that he is trying to embellish, or the narratives he's trying to tell, are going to be forever, because we have not, as human beings, yet evolved out of whatever form we currently in. And so we're still subjected to whatever emotions and whatever tropes or storylines that our brains still respond to.
And let's talk about like what takes so long. It's not just the fact that they're, attention to details of the animation. I mean, the stories for sure, because he's even said like he doesn't storyboard really. He kind of lets it organically happen as it goes, which is such a an antiquated way of thinking. But thank God someone still is. This kind of tells you everything you need to know about the difference between like Disney and Miyazaki films, where just look at the background. Every single person, place, or thing is meticulously placed. Every single and there's a lot going on in a Miyazaki film. If we're in town, you're gonna see what the bread maker's doing, what the the blacksmith is doing, and they all have unique facial expressions to kind of convey what the mood and the tone of the populace. Where in some Disney films, like it's just kind of those like those track those like repeating looping track facial expressions that they just kind of cut and paste. Especially in Pixar films, I've noticed that a lot, like Finding Nemo or something. They're just like, okay, we're just going to copy this fish like a million times on the screen, and they're all going to kind of make the same face, where you get to like each person, even if it's an extra, gets to kind of act and tell a story of what's going on in that scene in a Miyazaki film.
I think that what you're talking about, what takes so long, is definitely being reflected in an industry discussion, because I remember when Coco, that movie came out about Dia de los Muertos, they were being praised that the complex background of the ghost city in the background was meticulously animated. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you had, again, Into the Spider-Verse, where then the animators were saying, we were solving these problems in production where we just painted abstract shapes into the background. And so they went the total other direction, where they knew that they had to fill up the spaces and the cityscapes. And so they were like, we're just going to do these compositions, is what they called them. They didn't even, people in buses and people in buildings, they were just blobs. They were just blobs of compositions.
Jay?
That doesn't lead us in anything. It's just a great point. What do you say to that?
That was a great point, Sam.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So let's talk a little bit about, we mentioned just like the settings as far as magical realism goes, because they do feel like real films, like stuff's happening to real people, just with the freedom of being able to animate and go that extra step to make it more fantastical. It's not just so much magical realism, because I feel like that's just something that's just like on screen and you're kind of oh, okay, you know, the cat in the hat is talking to the kids and that's just what I'm watching, where Miyazaki is more immersive realism, where he's trying to, you know, sit you down and make you feel the wind on your face. It's almost like a 4D experience, because the sound is so texturized and it's so rich and the animation is so fluid without being too realistic, or you know, too wonky, like Jason said, like a rotoscope. Not trying to talk you into being like you're watching a real thing, because it's still animated, and like you said, like people are reacting with their hair like going crazy, so you're still in an animated world, but you could still kind of lose yourself and become part of that animated world.
Well, I think you have an easier time suspending your disbelief when you're watching anime for whatever reason. So there's nothing that he has hand drawn that you couldn't do with computers now, or even like camera tricks in the 80s. There's nothing really unique about what he was doing that other people weren't doing to the same extent with other films. I think the strength of doing the animated films versus like camera tricks or some sort of like claymation or models or something like that, I think it just immersed you more immediately. For whatever reason, the fact that it didn't look real because it was animated made it easier for you to get into it. It seems a little counterintuitive, but when you think about it, when you're watching like an animated fantasy film, you're committed right away, versus anything that has a little verisimilitude. It kind of has that uncanny valley quality where you're sort of like, but this is kind of a thing, but okay. The way things are here is just like that. Whatever, I'm just going to watch the movie. But for whatever reason, you get immersed a little bit faster in animated film. And I think that's why he's free to go more fantastical earlier, just because people buy it on the basis of, well, this is drawn, so like I don't have to worry about, could this be real? I'm just going to be like, oh yeah, that castle moves around. Cool, got it. And that's just a thing I accept. And that's how you just get people to just be completely sold on, you know, friendly forest creatures and moving castles and angry spirit dragons and everything you want to put in a movie.
I think it's interesting that when he uses magical realism, he uses it as any other cinematic device, that he kind of eases you into it. I mean, when you look at like 3 different of his movies, you look at like Totoro and then Spirited Away, they all kind of start off very mundane, and very quickly you fall down the rabbit hole of things are getting more strange and you're being introduced to magical creatures, you know, things like that. And then you look at his one of his first movies, and it was like, what was it? I can't remember the name of that movie. That's right. Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind. And it immerses you immediately into that you are in this strange world, the strange land, because that opening scene of the protagonist kind of spelunking through this crazy poisonous forest with all these strange creatures, you're like suddenly thrust into the weirdness of it all. And I think it's interesting because earlier we were talking about how Miyazaki uses pacing for like those really mundane things, the juxtaposed scale of like the world in this great upheaval. Also using how like weird and how stylized things are also kind of gets you into like how much do you buy into the fact that this is like an animated movie, and how immersed are you in the story.
You know what's funny about you using Nausicaa as an example is that is the first project that he wrote himself. He wrote a manga and then he adapted the manga, versus working on somebody else's like Future Boy Conan or Lupin the Third or something like that. This was 100% his original IP, and the fact that I think he wrote the story himself, I think made him realize what about the story was indispensable and what you could thrust on people and where you could start it. And I think that he took a lot of risks just because he understood the story better than anything he'd worked on up to that point.
What really surprised me also in recent kind of cinematic filmmaking is I there's always that debate in like anime circles of that one scene in Akira with the bike when Akira goes sideways and you get this like scene of like this long shot of the bike going like symmetrical across the frame, and then it's overlaid with like this was done in Batman and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle and all these other scenes, right? Well, the opening for the newest trilogy of Star Wars films, Star Wars 7, and you're just like, you see Rey spelunking through this wreckage, and you're like, that's the opening scene of Nausicaa, and you just like see like a heroine in a dangerous place, and it's very strange, and they're climbing through these like this grand scale, and I saw that scene, I was just like, and I really wonder is like, where do they get these things from? And then, you know, Jason, like, you're right, like Miyazaki does have full control over what is indispensable and what is not, and it's just like, as a director, you have every control over that scene. Why did he decide to make that scene that way? Why did he not just walk up to the thing? Why did she have to like rappel down or like be in such like a precarious or such a dangerous environment? Like, what does that say about the story? And it's like, it kind of becomes one of those tropes. Yeah. And earlier we were talking about flying and the concept of flying. And then if you fly, you've also got this concept of falling. And so like that inherent danger of being happy that you're flying, but then also being like suddenly realizing you can't fly anymore and you're going to fall to your death. Especially
the scene that sticks out is the scene from Lupin the Third, the castle Cagliostro. It's super dreamlike. It's when Wolf is crawling up those battlements and those rooftops, and he's just like with like ease, kind of, right, and like impossible ease, and then he's just like falling, and then while he's falling, now he's like jumping, from rooftop to rooftop. It's just like, I've had that dream before. The protagonist of a Miyazaki film is a lot different, and protagonist I say loosely, because usually they're whoever your POV character is, like, very ambiguous. He doesn't spell it out for you, like who you should really be rooting for. Sam, what do you think makes a Miyazaki protagonist more relatable than say just like a standard like westernized POV character?
If I could interject briefly, I think you need to differentiate between an adapted Miyazaki protagonist and an original Miyazaki protagonist. When he originates the script and like writes everything and isn't basing it off somebody else's IP, the protagonist is a little bit different than like something adapted.
Sure.
So if you compare something like Kiki's Delivery Service to something like Howl's Moving Castle, I think you have to answer that question two different ways.
I always felt like his protagonists were very, they were very ordinary. They were just, you could put yourself as a viewer into the shoes of those protagonists. That you were going about this really normal, average life, and the world had its own rules and circumstances. And suddenly it could feel that you were thrust into those things, into these situations. Like, Spirited Away won an Academy Award and was widespread here in the West. And so that was my first Miyazaki movie that I saw. And when you think about that, it's just like a girl who is moving with her parents to a new neighborhood. Right. And that's like very relatable. And she doesn't have superpowers. She's not particularly brave. There wasn't any backstory about that. She was like Black Widow and had amazing assassin powers that she just kept in her back pocket. She was just like a little girl that was like, I'm bored and I've been just kind of wandering around this moment when my parents stopped the car. And now I'm in this kind of like this situation. And I feel that that's kind of like the quintessential Miyazaki character. Of course, you've got some other ones like Nausicaa. They're like the protagonist, she's a princess. Not everyone's a princess. And then like Princess Mononoke, like not everyone is a warrior or a prince. Like there's a little bit more. But like when you look at like Kiki's Delivery Service, it's like a coming of age story. You look at like Howl's Moving Castle, and then the female protagonist there, she's just like a person just trying to get by and like live in this world. And it feels like a protagonist is like very average, very relatable, very vulnerable, very kind of honest and kind of bare bones. But it's like their attitude when being given a situation that's very fantastic. Like, what would you do in this situation? Do you have the courage to stand up to the evil enemy, or do you have the bravery to sum it up, or can you bite the bullet? Can you bear it? Can you persist in this really, really strange and terrible situation? I feel like that is one of the one of the things that kind of makes like a Miyazaki very quintessentially Miyazaki.
I think when he does original stuff, his heroes are more Campbellian, which is to say they follow the Joseph Campbell's hero's journey path, which is a circle, basically. You start out comfortable, and then you are uncomfortable for the entire movie, and then you end up back where you started, changed, improved, but like ultimately, it's like, okay, we made it back to the Shire alive. When it's based on a manga or something like that, or a series, you can't really do a hero's journey type deal, because you can do a freak of the week type, oh, that was the monster we fought, and then the monster's dead. But you're not really like edifying the character as much as you are in something like, okay, this is an ordinary character. They have a call to adventure. They get supernatural aid, overcome the threshold. All the beats from a Campbellian journey. You can't really do that if that character is supposed to like take on the next challenge in the next issue of the manga or the next episode of the show. So I think whenever he does his own original stuff, the characters are a lot more Campbellian. And when he's doing something like, oh, I'm doing Future Boy Conan or Lupin the Third, or even something like Kiki's Delivery Service, which was from a manga, I think you're less likely to have a mundane protagonist, because Kiki is a witch. She has powers at the very beginning, versus the character from Spirited Away that didn't know anything about their power, and they learned that over the course of the film. So it's really interesting to look at the stuff that he originated versus stuff that he adapted, because he kind of takes two different approaches, and he works within like the confines of what he can actually do to the character. And I think he does that masterfully.
That's totally fair, because Lupin the Third is definitely it has a like an episode of the week type feel to it.
It feels like a very long episode of the TV show.
Yeah. And like you said, like in Spirited Away, or even like in Princess Mononoke, they both kind of, one of them's just like, I am a leader, I am there for good, but then he winds up killing a spirit that he shouldn't have, because nothing in a Miyazaki film is as it seems on face value. So, he just kind of jumped the gun, and then he and then he meets up with Princess Mononoke, and they both have to go on this transformative experience of, it's not just like, nature is correct and the people are wrong. It's somewhere in the middle, and that was the arc. So it's never relatability. I think is the biggest difference between his films and a Western film, because as a Western audience member, as you two gentlemen are, Lifetime, in what we grew up with was white princesses, or like Aladdin types or something like that, which is it's very entertaining, and it's something to aspire to be, but it's not extremely relatable like it is in like Spirited Away, where she literally has to, they take the time to show her putting on her shoes and like tapping them in, because she is a human being. She's like you said, Sam, a petulant kind of bored youth because her parents are disconnected. I think you nailed it when you said just relatability, whether wrong, right, or otherwise.
I also wonder a lot about what is the effect of Japanese history and Japanese culture, especially during wartime, and also like living in a society in which your entire society collapsed because you lost a very big war, and what was that effect culturally on Miyazaki in creating these films? Because in the United States, we have Batman, we have Captain America, we have Superman, we have these heroes that follow a very circular journey of they power up and they return transformed. And in some of these movies, I mean, of course, story structure is very different when you have a series, but even for like the singular Miyazaki characters, they don't return transformed. They return introspectively transformed, that they've gone through this very interesting journey. And half of the time, it's like an allegory for something else. It's like an allegory of personal growth or introspective growth or a coming of age. And then it kind of makes you think. And like even the antagonists in a lot of the stories, like you kind of relate to them because at some point they themselves have forgotten what it took to have them become what they've become. Whereas in the West, it's like you've got a villain and that villain just needs to be killed or needs to be put in jail or needs to be defeated and fall in a fiery death, and that's kind of it. And so a lot of times when I watch like Miyazaki films, I see a lot of fluidity in kind of, you know, where we start and where we end, and it feels there are these cathartic moments that drive the story forward. But even at the end of like Spirited Away, I'm like, wait a second, it's just like all a dream, or is it like it never happened? Or you kind of question like the sense of time. How long did that actually take? And not to spoil the ending of the movie, you know, because we want the viewers to watch it and see for themselves. But it's like a really interesting, like, it really makes me scratch my head. And definitely every single time I've watched it, I always notice something kind of different, either about one of the secondary characters or one of the villains or whatever.
Yeah, because Lady Eboshi, like, she's just like, oh, on first introduction, it's just like she's the evil person to do evil, to root against because she's evil. But then it's just like, is she? Because she's all the lepers are quite happy, you know, with how she treats them. They're always smiling, you know. She treats them with dignity and respect, and all these people that work for her, you know. It's always more deep than just bad guy is bad or good guy is good, you know. Like I said, even the protagonists, you know, they rush and they stumble through things without thinking, you know, them through completely. So it's a real humanization that he does masterfully, better than some, you know, actual, you know, traditional filmmakers, non-animated.
Well, who is gonna be more apt to come at the angle from bad guys not always obvious and bad than someone whose father made planes to use for the side that lost World War II, right? Like, I think a lot of Eastern art that's influenced by that era, I think has a tendency to be a little bit more nuanced than good guy wear white hat, bad guy wear black hat, good guy fight bad guy, good guy win, which is it's very reductive, and we kind of see that over and over in Western art. But I think Eastern art is sort of like there's a more nuanced take to it, and I think as that influence has crept in, I think it has made Western art a little bit more nuanced. When even a character like Darth Vader, who is like bad guy wear black hat to the max, right? They humanized him a lot, especially in the later films. And I think a lot of that owes to the fact that Lucas was inspired to do Star Wars by a Japanese film called Hidden Fortress. And I think it's no accident that Nausicaa seemed to influence later Star Wars films, for example. So I think that there's a little bit more nuance when you have to write a villain that isn't just, oh, villains are always... The guy who loses is always the bad guy, right, and his motives are always completely terrible. So I kind of think, you know, it's like, well, how would a German person write a villain when in America it's like bad guy wears skull, good guy beats skull guy. I think it puts the onus on you to put a little bit more nuance into how you develop your villains, and I think he's done that very well, and I think it's probably in no small part to the fact that his father played a role in the war effort.
You bring up a good point, Jason, because when directors are crafting narratives, they have to create these motivations for their protagonists, and they also have to create motivations for their antagonists. So it's like, well, how did that evil person get to where they got to? They had to have had motivations that they follow logically to get them to develop a certain way to be at the end point that they are. And in several kind of like, I would say modern-esque, like Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, and Howl's Moving Castle, that era of Miyazaki film, halfway through the film, or 3/4 of the way through the film, when you get to know the antagonist a little bit more, there's this moment, there's this inflection point where it shifts, where you suddenly are like, maybe they're not the villain, and they were like, circumstances brought them to this, because it's not like they're actually doing anything really horrible. They're just causing blockages in the current protagonist's storyline, or they're creating challenges, or they're creating roadblocks.
Change.
So it's just like, yeah. So it's kind of, it kind of gets me to think about it like that a little bit. It's like what really is how Miyazaki, because the whole time we've been talking about Miyazaki and protagonists, it's also like, how does Miyazaki, approach antagonists? Mm-hmm. And I do think you bring up a good point, Jason, earlier. It's like, yeah, his dad was in the war effort that was part of the Axis, the bad guys of World War II, and modern Japanese history. There's a lot of of this modern and younger generation that's just like, no, we don't condone that war, and that's not great. That's not a good part of our history. Same with Germany. There's a lot of people that are like, that's not a great part of our history. And even Miyazaki in the past has been criticized over that. The Wind Rises, he was criticized over that. And then also, even though he did not do Grave of the Fireflies, Studio Ghibli did release Grave of the Fireflies. And if you've seen that movie, it is starkly anti-war. It is very... it's very gut-wrenching. And at first, some people watch it. If you come into it with a context of being very critical of and very anti-Japanese and very anti-Axis power, you're going to be like, oh, this is just like propaganda to make them feel like, oh, woe is us, we lost the war. But it's just like, hold on a second. Not every, people being suffering in the war, civilian casualties, all those kinds of things, all those war themes, you're just like, wow, yeah, that's a very scathing criticism of his own society, of his own political leadership of the war. So when I saw it, I was like, wow, it was very gut-wrenching, and you can kind of unravel it in memory parts. And even though Miyazaki did not work on that film as a director, it did come out of that studio, and it was released in the same year as My Neighbor Totoro. And so I really wonder, what are the Miyazaki influences on that movie that Miyazaki didn't publicly put his face to?
Japanese studios deal with stuff that was set in the World War II era is the consequence of World War II. Say for the Germans was like, oh shit, how do we let this happen? But I think for the Japanese, it was less like, oh, how do we let this happen? It was more like, we've just learned of our own fallibility. We bought into the idea that the emperor was infallible and Japan was, ordained, and we were divinely blessed, and we're going to go out and win the war. And what happened was, they got their asses handed to them, even though they were willing to fight to the last man. And something so powerful and terrible as a nuclear bombs descending on them was what was necessary to make them surrender. I think they thought if they just put enough effort into it, they could, basically manifest their destiny. And it didn't work out. So I think the media that came after that was like, well, what would happen to the people that really didn't buy into that narrative that Japan is like the, divinely ordained infallible nation? And I think that's why Grave of the Fireflies is so powerful, because those kids were too young and didn't have anybody enforcing that narrative. So the fact that they were completely innocent and just, they didn't have that component of yeah, this sucks, but we're doing it for the war effort. They were just like, we're kids and this blows. So I think that maybe the fact that so much of the stories seem to be influenced by how Japan dealt with losing World War II, even the stuff that's only allegorically deals with that. I think that's why you have something like Grave of the Fireflies coming out of the same studio, even though Miyazaki himself didn't do it.
It's also interesting because Miyazaki, in his work, he's clearly a feminist. He's clearly an environmentalist, and in these themes of man versus nature, as well as the haves and the have-nots and different positions in society. And from Miyazaki's standpoint, when being Japanese in Japanese culture, he did not have a diverse multiracial culture like in the U.S. And so for him, it was just like, you've got the ruling class and the working class. And so it was very economical, and it was very sociologically driven. It wasn't necessarily the color of your skin or where you immigrated from. It was just everyone's Japanese, right? And so for him, it was just, he just created these situations where it was we're harming the environment. We're trying to industrialize, but we're harming the environment. And the environment and Mother Nature has come to punish us. And in an interview in the past, he was also quoted, he was just like, maybe I want to see a future in which the world is flooded, and he kind of sees like this is where we are going in terms of climate change, and he's not like, it's 2020. He's not like some young person being very radical about this thought. He's an old man who's lived 70 years of his life being like, yeah, climate change is coming. And I think that's very stark for the Japanese culture because they live on an island and like they've always been very understanding of climate change. And it's just like the economic factors and government and geopolitics and war and all of these things make someone like Miyazaki very, very worried. And we started off this conversation talking about like, oh, is he the Disney? Is he the Japanese Disney? And he himself has said, no, I'm not, because I really want to make art that people think about and affects culture, not just something to pass the time or to just talk about explosions. And so he's like, he's okay with everyone dying. He's okay with Mother Nature flooding the earth and having there be mass extinction. And there's a part of him that's been quoted in our interviews that he would prefer that. He would prefer a quieting of the earth and a back to basics of sorts.
It's important to show the brutality, but he never romanticizes it. Like Princess Mononoke is 100%. It's just like balls to the wall, blood and guts all the time. Animals getting blown apart, people getting their arms, their limbs ripped off by arrows. But it's never like, oh, that was super cool. It's just like, this is real, and this is what war looks like, and I'm gonna show you that no one wins. You see the protagonists get theirs just as much as the antagonists, with super air quotes, because everything is super ambiguous in that, and kind of the same thing, in Spirited Away or Howl's Moving Castle. Like when there is violence or brutality, it's never in a way where it's just like, it's never that Western, like, oh, it's super cool. It's like insert blood and guts because we need, the kids to focus and like this. It's more so just like, we're just going to show you how it really is. It's almost done in like a unnerving and uneasy, like National Geographic way.
Well, his protagonists are usually younger people that aren't the ones inflicting the violence. They're trying to survive the violence. And I think being a 4-year-old in 1945 will kind of instill that fear in you.
Sure. More
so than like some American who grew up in the 80s watching Die Hard and was like, yeah, shit, yeah, I'm John McCain. You're John McClane, not John McCain. Or both, I don't know.
It's very similar. Yeah.
Yippee-ki-yay, my friend. Miyazaki describes himself as a pessimistic. He says, for instance, when one of my staff has a baby, you can't help but bless them for a good future, because I can't tell the child, oh, you shouldn't have come into this life. And yet I know the world is headed in a bad direction. So with those conflicting thoughts in mind, I think about the kind of films I should be making. So I think you absolutely nailed it. I think that quote encapsulates what both of you were saying, was that he's very pessimistic. Maybe he does want to see the world flooded, but at the same time, it's not innocent people's faults, and I think that's why he has innocent people as the protagonist of some crazy thing they had no control over going on around them and just trying to survive it, versus like them having a jetpack and a ray gun and just going and blasting everything. Most of the time they have to stop something bad from happening versus like make something bad happen to stop something worse from happening.
I wonder how he reconciles that if he himself is a pessimist, that must explain a lot of why the majority of his protagonists are optimists, and they're all very hopeful, and they're all very brave, and they're honest, and they're faithful. They are obviously challenged during their journeys, but they all pretty much are pretty good people to start off with.
Probably because they're all young,
really
right?
Has like some.
What choice do they have?
Like some kind of like a Joker anti-hero.
He identifies with the antagonist, and that's why he writes nuanced on antagonists so well. He says the villains are all part of me. For years, I've been wondering what it would be like if all those negative elements were forced onto the main character side. I can understand a character with that kind of anger. So, like, he writes villains that don't see themselves as the villains. They have their opinion, I think the fact that he sort of has innocent children be the protagonist and has like angry, jaded, pessimistic people just trying to inflict their worldview on everyone be the villain. I think the fact that he identifies more with the antagonist is one of the reasons he writes them so well.
Yeah, he's still a cigarette smoker at 78 years old. That's in the year 2020. That's every bit of pessimist that you need. Just closing out this episode, let's get just like, it sounds like I know we're all around the same age and we've all kind of grown up watching these films. What are just certain scenes or just certain films in general that really mean a lot to you personally, from a aspect of a Miyazaki fan? And we'll start with Sam.
For me, it was Spirited Away, because it was I moved around a lot as a kid, and I just totally relate to not wanting to move, just not wanting to move again to somewhere new. And then, but what's interesting about this is that this movie, Spirited Away, has nothing to do with actually moving. They go on this side quest even before they get to their new neighborhood. And what is also really cool to me is just like stumbling into this world and doing exactly what the title of the movie is just getting spirited away and falling down that rabbit hole and just being, I guess, immersed into this and feeling very lost into a new world. And that's sometimes when I was a kid and I moved to a new neighborhood, I felt very lost. And so I really kind of really identified with that movie. It's just one of my favorite movies, and it's also very interesting, lots of twists and turns. And so that's just kind of how I see it. And also a lot of the themes of capitalism in that movie. It's just like everyone has a job and has to work, and they're all so money hungry in that thing. Whereas just like the main character, Chichiro, she's just the little girl. She's just trying to get by, and she's trying to save her parents. And then also the theme of forgetting, because when you're in the spirit world, you forget. And the only way to break free from the spell and get your own freedom is to remember your own name again, is to remember. And it's like there's these very interesting rules that you watch this movie, you're like, oh, these are ridiculous, I would never fall for that. But oftentimes we live in our world and we forget things about our own lives. We forget about our values, our commitments. And then at the end of the movie, when you kind of come out of that movie, you think to yourself, gee, what have I forgotten? And what have I been wrapped up in? And I thought it was great. And those were the themes that really jump out at me that make that particular film, Spirited Away, so powerful.
Jay?
I think his work on Lupin the Third, it's underestimated, its influence on all the anime that came after it. So when I was in college, Shinichiro Watanabe came to my campus and gave like a talk to like the anime club, but it was open to everybody, which is good because I was not in the anime club. And a bunch of my friends who didn't go to school there were like, can we come and sit in on this? I was like, yeah, absolutely. So all my friends who were total weebs in high school, they shared a little bit of anime with me, but like I didn't watch nearly the volume that they watched. They came up and we all went to this lecture, and I was kind of trolling them a little bit because they're like, I think Cowboy Bebop is like the most influential anime that's ever been made. I was like, no, Lupin the Third for sure. And I was just being a dick, right? But then somebody asked Shinichiro Watanabe what he thought the most anime that influenced him the most. He's like, Lupin the Third for sure. And I was dying because like I thought I was like, I was just trolling you guys. But when you really think about it, so much of what Watanabe did after Cowboy Bebop, he did Samurai Champloo, Space Dandy, and he actually in 2012 did a Lupin the Third project. So I thought that was really interesting that somebody who is basically from the 1980s on influenced a ton of anime like Watanabe was enormously influenced by Lupin the Third, and I think it really sort of grew the beard when Miyazaki started working on it, especially Castle Cagliostro, because I think that kind of thrust that series into the forefront in Japan. It was sort of like just another series, but I think that movie kind of made more people notice the series, at least in Japan. And it's one of those movies that like it's a good entry point into anime for people in the West. So I really wish that Lupin the Third kind of got the get the credit for how influential it's been, because I think if you go and watch it now, you're like, oh, a lot of these tropes are kind of hack. But I think what people don't realize is like they're hack because Lupin did them and everybody else copied them. So there's so much in that series that's imitable that everybody sort of like aped later. And then you go and watch it now, you're like, oh, this is just every other anime. But I really wish it got more credit for being as influential as it is.
I that was one of the ones that I just watched for the first time, even though it came out in 1979. And I thought of a episode of one of these that we did, Jason, while watching that, when he's kind of falling down through like the storm drain through the clock or whatever, and there's like all those bodies in that room. I was just like, this is a scene right out of Violence Voyager, which is that weird animated film that you and I watched and we reviewed, and that came out in 2018. So I completely echo your sentiment about that type of anime, like still to this day is influencing today's animators, and that's crazy. There's a lot of those themes that you still feel, not just in, because Violence Voyager was an Eastern film, but in Western films as well. My first film that I saw from Miyazaki was Princess Mononoke. I probably saw it way too young, very brutal, but I have to completely agree with Sam. Spirited Away was it's junior in high school, and I just remember it making me kind of step out of my own teenage skis and think a little bit more big picture, because we're as a 17-year-old, you're so wrapped up in your own funk because like your hormones make you be that way. But like I'm just sitting there, I'm like looking at No Face, and it just wants to fit in, and it's just like, oh, all you crazy spirits are in this bathhouse, capitalism, and I'm just gonna strong tipper do all the things, and then like this spirit learns a lesson, and that was like really affecting to me. A lot of the journey that Chichiro goes on, it's just so goddamn relatable, especially, if you watch this as a youth, or even putting it on, today for my kids. That is just such a generational film that could affect the people that watched it back in 2001 at any age, and it's still affecting my kids now, from ages spectrum 6 to 17 in 2020. It's just that's probably a top 10 best film of all time, just for the fact of how affecting it is. Just such a masterpiece of cinema, and such an important piece, and I'm glad it exists.
It's great for teenagers, because being a teenager is all about trying to figure out who you are, right? And that was the whole point of Spirited Away, is trying to remember to be yourself.
Hayao Miyazaki discussion on this episode of Film Hooligans. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Let's go around the horn. I want to, on behalf of Jason and I, really want to thank our special guest tonight for this episode, Sam Tang. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I just had a great time. Miyazaki is one of like my favorite filmmakers of all time, and we were joking around on Twitter. We were like, let's talk about two different filmmakers, Tarantino and Miyazaki. And so I mean, here we are. We're talking about Miyazaki. So I just thank you so much for the invite on the show.
Oh yeah, that would have been an episode. I don't know what kind of that would have been definitely interesting. But if you ever want to come back for the Tarantino episode, which is forthcoming, I'm sure you are more than welcome. Where can everyone find you, Sam?
I am on Twitter and on Instagram at the same handle, at Samo Tango. It's just my name, Sam Tang, with O's at the end. Samo Tango. It just makes it easy.
Absolutely. Jason Edwin Alt. Where can everyone find you, sir?
I am Jason E. Alt on the Twitter, and if you go there, I have a pinned post on my profile that has links to all the different projects I work on around the internet.
Perfect. And if you would like to talk movies with us directly on the Twitters, you could do so by following us at film_hooligans. If you want to follow me personally, I'm at Orzov Dunn. Until next time, Jason, do something obnoxious, because we don't have a sign off.
We don't have an outro. Oh no! I did it. Was that obnoxious enough?
Yes.
I've been drinking.